Good afternoon. A show of hands, who ate? That's more than half the room, that's good. I'm David French. I'm your moderator for today. I'm the Managing Director with Away Home Canada. And if you are attending the session, Dynamics Around Home, you're in the right place. I've asked our presenters if it's okay that I not read their bios, and they've all taken a pass on that. Because we want to get right to the series of presentations, and they will be up here for the Q&A that follows their presentations. But because there's 6 of them, it was a bit of a full house. So we're going to have them come up to the stage and do their presentation, and then they'll come back up at the end if we've got time for questions, which I hope we do. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your opportunity to listen and engage with these important stakeholders and presenters. And as somebody who played a role in crafting the youth stream for Away Home Canada, it's always nice to see the live and in-person versions of these people who I've seen one-dimensionally for the last 2.5 years. And so we've made a decision that you're going first, so I'll call up Naomi.
Hi, everyone. It's always hard to be the first speaker after lunch, so I'll try my best to keep you guys awake and engaged. So I think I have to get someone else to help me advance the slides, if I can catch his attention. So this quote comes from a study that we just wrapped up, Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness, which I'll discuss in a minute. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about like homelessness prevention and what it is we're trying to achieve when we do the work that we do. And Sean, who's sitting in the front row, what I want to do is I want to start with just by kind of laying the foundation for like 3 studies that really impacted me quite significantly, and just kind of level set what we know in terms of homelessness prevention and housing. So Sean and his colleagues in 2016, when I was still a PhD student, they followed 51 young people. Half of them were from Halifax and half were from Toronto. And they had transitioned away from homelessness and had achieved like relative housing stability. But what they measured a bunch of things, and one of the things that they measured is hope. And what they found was over the course of a year, that hope started to decline over time. And in their discussion, they talked a little bit about, you know, could this be related to sort of those false promises that come with what life might be like once we exit homelessness? And because many young people shared that they felt like they didn't belong and they really couldn't make any gains forward. And at the time, I was doing a similar study. I was following young people that were in market rent housing that had exited homelessness within the last month, and I was learning similar things as well. And really, Sean and his colleagues at the time, I think they were one of the first teams really anywhere to do this kind of work, because we really didn't have much in terms of longitudinal research about what it's like for young people once they exit homelessness. So if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So a couple of years later, the Lancet, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Lancet, it's kind of this fancy, bougie journal, and they published what's a review. So they did a review of reviews. So a literature review, for those who might not be familiar, is basically you look at a topic and you grab a bunch of papers about that topic and you publish a review. So these guys reviewed all the reviews that were done out there, specifically on what works in terms of inclusion, helping people feel included in society, folks that are marginalized. So they did 76 reviews, looked at 76 reviews. And when it came to youth specifically, they said, really, there's not much out there at all for young people that are socially excluded. And one thing that really jumped out at me was in all the studies that they looked at, there was not one study that looked at inclusion and reintegration into society as their primary outcome. So people maybe look at things like housing stability, but as many of you know, housing stability does not always equal inclusion, right? So that's really stuck with me. And then finally, this last study, if we could advance the slide. Thank you. This was published by our colleague Matthew Morton in the US, And I would say this is probably the most comprehensive review done to date. And he looked at 54 interventions done for young people that are experiencing homelessness or trying to exit homelessness. And he says there really still is not enough rigorous evidence in terms of like what works to help young people that are exiting homelessness or even experiencing homelessness. And he lists some of the things that we just still don't have good evidence for, like outreach, transitional living programs, shelters, host homes, and rapid rehousing. So I think we've done some internal program evaluations, which are great, and we have maybe some hunches about what might work, but still we just don't have enough evidence on this. And so that's really formed sort of the basis of my work, which is to look at how we can do a better job of helping young people once they exit homelessness and feel more included in society. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is the study that we just wrapped up in March of this year. So what we did is we worked with 3 community partners, so the Raft in St. Catharines, Living Rock in Hamilton, and Covenant House in Toronto. And we gave 24 young people rent subsidies, and they were portable, so they could live wherever they wanted with the rent subsidies, move as often as they wanted to, between $400 and $500 a month for 2 years. And we followed them for 2.5 years because we also wanted to see what it was like for young people once they didn't get the rent subsidies anymore. And then what we did is, so everybody, to be clear, everyone got rent subsidies, and then we randomly assigned half of them to a mentor. And we wanted to see if the young people who got rent subsidies and mentorship experienced more social and economic inclusion compared to the young people who only got the rent subsidies. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what happened there. Okay, so, remember how I was talking about that Lancet article that showed that how really nobody's looking at inclusion as a primary outcome measure? So the reason for that is because it's super hard to measure because it's like a whole bunch of things. Housing stability is much easier to measure. It's like you're housed or you're not housed, right? So we had to put together a few instruments that we think, if you're doing well in these things, we think that maybe you've experienced social and economic inclusion. So we picked community integration, self-esteem, hope, connectedness, and education, employment, and training. And what we found was that our outcomes in both of those groups were stable, but the group that got the mentorship did not do significantly better than the group that just got the rent subsidies. So there really was no difference between the groups. Now, there was one big complication that we were not anticipating. This study started in 2019, and the pandemic hit less than a year into this study. So it made it really challenging for our mentees and mentors to connect. So that could have been a reason that we just only saw stable outcomes over time. There were a couple of surprises, and one of them was that 1 in 4 of our young people took that rent subsidy money and they moved back home with their family. So I thought that might happen like after the study was done, when they didn't have money anymore, but they took it and they moved back home. And I know our family and natural supports folks in the room are like, well, I'm not surprised. But that was a surprise to me, and I thought that was really interesting. And my colleague, Mike Lethby, at the Raft always says that sometimes we forget that family is a really a great form of affordable housing, so something to think about. The other thing in terms of advocacy around portable rent subsidies, so we weren't really measuring housing stability. That wasn't the main thing we were looking at. But the fact that nobody lost their housing during the time that we were following them and during a pandemic, and the fact that the outcomes actually didn't decrease over time, because as I remember Sean was saying this one time in a conference, that stable outcomes over time for our young people are actually a good thing, because a lot of times when you're measuring their outcomes, once they exit homelessness, they tend to go down. So the fact that these outcomes were stable despite a global pandemic, I think is a compelling reason for advocating for portable rent subsidies maybe. So we gave, for example, in Toronto, $500 a month. So that's $6,000 a year. Supportive housing in Toronto costs $24,000 a year per young person, and the annual cost of a shelter stay is $40,000 a year. So 6.5 times less expensive, if you want to look at it that way, than staying in a shelter. So some advocacy work, I think, around portable rent subsidies there for sure. Informal mentors. So I'm gonna pick up on this in a minute, but the reason I have a whistle is because
about a third of our young people had informal mentors in their life. And an informal mentor serves like a coach-like kind of role. And so we saw qualitatively, so I met one-on-one with half of the young people in the study every 6 months. We conducted 71 interviews over a 2.5-year period. And we were just seeing qualitatively that the young people that had this coach-like figure in their life seemed to be doing better. And so I went back to our statistician and I said, hey, can you go back to the baseline data and look at the young people that had informal mentors? Do they seem to be doing a little bit better in terms of some of these inclusion outcomes? And sure enough, when it came to psychological community integration, the young people who had informal mentors did significantly better in that outcome compared to the young people who did not have informal mentors. Now, it is a small study, so we have to be cautious when we say these things, but I thought that was really interesting. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that I met with one-on-one with young people. We conducted 71 interviews. So this conceptually is sort of what we did with our findings. So young people to varying degrees talked about, so they've all exited homelessness, right? They talked about being in a fog, not being able to see, talked about being in the dark. And I've come to understand that as like this liminal space where, you know, this in-between space where you're not homeless anymore, but you don't feel totally integrated into society. And I think just being in your 20s is kind of like that too, right? Like it's this transition space that you're in. So a lot of young people talked about that. And of course, a lot of this was related to living in the legacy of their past trauma or growing up in poverty. Some young people seem to be, as we followed them over 2.5 years, seem to be sort of stuck in this space. When we do a deeper dive into those young people, we saw that they were housed, but that house did not feel like a home. And they had limited internal and external connections. And what I mean by that is they didn't have a really great self-understanding, and they had maybe one significant relationship, and that was it. And if that went south, they would fall into depression and not be doing very well. But some of the young people seem to be sort of break free from this circling. And when we look closer at those young people, they told us they felt at home, not just housed. And they helped us understand that home is like both a physical space where you feel safe, but also a place mentally where you feel safe as well. They tended to have diverse connections, so a bunch of different connections in the community. And this is where those informal mentors came in. And often they would meet them in places like faith communities, school, or employment. And then another thing came up called identity capital, and this has come up for me before in my research, so what goes into identity capital is a sense of purpose, feeling in control of your life, self-efficacy, and self-esteem. And you use that as currency to pull you forward when life gets hard. So we all have identity capital, and it's nurtured in us from the minute that we're born. And so we saw that young people that tended to break free had a really strong identity capital. Now, I don't mean to say that this is sort of like this linear circle, because sometimes young people would seem like they were breaking free and something would go wrong and they'd be kind of going into circling a little bit. But young people that felt at home, had a bunch of connections, had strong identity capital, didn't spend as much time in this circle. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about like what it is all of us collectively are trying to do. We talk a lot about housing, but I think that sometimes we maybe need to talk more about homing young people, this sense of home, and what does home mean? And so I think that our Indigenous colleagues are so much further ahead in their understanding, their holistic understanding of home than we are. And so Jesse Thistle, as many of you I'm sure know, helped the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness come up with a definition on homelessness. And he talks about the importance of cultivating our spirit and being grounded. I love the term grounded in these networks of significance and how that contributes to a positive meaning in our life and a healthy sense of identity. And then furthermore, he quotes his colleague. Can you just move to the next slide? Thank you. Julie Christian, who further describes this sense of rootedness. So home is this sense of rootedness, and it's a sense of belonging. And that really resonated with me. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so my husband and I, about a year ago, we bought a farm, and on our farm is a forested area, and I spend a lot of time walking in the woods. And I was thinking about our work and what our Indigenous colleagues are teaching us about home, and I pass trees all the time. And so this is how I've come to understand what it is that we're trying to do when we prevent homelessness from reoccurring. I imagine young people, so one of the things that I think happens a lot is our young people get uprooted a lot, right? Like often they've been uprooted from childhood, and it happens again and again. And I think, what can we do so young people don't get uprooted? And what I saw in our work is that young people with a sense of purpose and meaning, which was always tied to spirituality, which I thought was really interesting, just naturally like go down into the soil, and they reach out into the community, and the community reaches back, and they have these deep roots, and then that flows up into this solid sense of identity. And then you see some external manifestations of inclusion, like housing stability or staying in school, for example. And when I say this, I don't mean to say that young people should bootstrap themselves out of homelessness. I'm not saying that at all, which is why I drew the sun. It's structural stuff. So we need good public policy, right? But the idea is that if we have sucky public policy and the storms of life come, those who have really deep roots embedded in community with a sense of purpose and meaning are less likely to be uprooted again. And that's how I'm starting to conceptualize home and the work that we do. Next slide, please. And that takes me to Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness 2.0. So I'm not very good at titles, so I just called one 1.0, not 2.0. If you guys can think of a better one, that'd be awesome. So we're going to go back to the drawing board, and this time we're going to switch out mentors with coaches, and I'll tell you what I mean in a minute. So now we have 4 community partners, so the same ones as before, and Stepstones for Youth in Toronto reached out to us. They work with youth leaving child welfare, and they asked if they could join. We said, absolutely, that'd be great. So we're going to have 40 young people, and we're going to give them rent subsidies for a year. So again, everyone gets a rent subsidy, and we had a very generous donor. So now we've been the rent subsidies will be between $700 and $800 a month, so $300 more than last time, which is great. So everyone gets that. And then randomly, we're going to assign half the group to a co-designed leadership program, which I'll show you in a minute. It was co-designed with young people who've experienced homelessness. Half of them are from our TYOH 1.0, and half of them are young people that I just know and they've experienced homelessness. And they're also going to be assigned a coach, so one coach for 10 young people. And what I realized is there is a difference. I didn't get this before. There's a difference between mentoring and coaching. So if you imagine, like if you're a Raptors fan, and so Nick Nurse is a coach of the Raptors, last time I checked. And so a mentor might be somebody that you go for coffee with, say. But a coach is somebody who, like Nick Nurse, is cheering you on from the sidelines. At no point in time would Nick Nurse ever say to one of his players, oh, you sit on the bench and I'm going to go and play for you. Like, that doesn't happen. They help you see things differently. They don't even come alongside you always. They call you off and they help you strategize about where you might go and how you might see things a little bit differently. So that was the piece that I think was missing, because when some feedback from our mentors from TYOH 1.0 was, it was kind of hard to connect with the young people that didn't have a sense of purpose, because it's kind of like, imagine if you're like lost at Union Station and someone says, hey, can I help you, and give you directions, and you're like, well, I don't really know where I'm going. Then it's hard to give someone directions, right? And that was the feedback we got from the mentors. So this time we're going to try to foster that identity capital, that sense of purpose, and that control or belief that you can achieve your purpose. So that's what we're doing here. Thank you. So what we've done is, so what I did is, I'm kind of like a geek on leadership stuff. So I pulled together a 12 chapter, it's supposed to be done over a year, manual, and then I brought it to young people. So it's split into thirds, and after every third chapter, there's like a break, a chapter where you just kind of reflect. And the first third is really kind of to set the foundation. There's a lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, the idea that you don't lead with your feelings, you kind of lead with your mind and your feelings will catch up. People call that behavioral activation therapy, which is great for depression. We talk a lot about what are your core values? And this is good. This is really good for all of us. I learned a lot by doing this. Like, what are your core values, and how do you feel when you're living into your core values, and how do you feel when you aren't living into your core values? So that's the first third. And then there's some strategies. For those of you who like the book Atomic Habits from James Clear, that's woven in here as well. Like, what are some sort of life hacks or strategies to help you achieve your goals and live out your core values? And then finally, the last third gets a bit deeper. And here I've woven in, for those of you who like Brene Brown's work, her work is woven in through here as well. But really getting to the heart of like identity-based habits and why and shame and vulnerability and living more wholeheartedly. So that's and living with a sense of purpose. So again, the whole idea here is to build that sense of identity capital, build that sense of purpose and feeling in control. And then next slide, please. Thank you. So we spent a full day with young people who've experienced homelessness. Some of you might recognize Marty Daly on the right here. She recently joined our team, and it's so fantastic. I don't think she's here. It's so fantastic to have her as part of the team with her, bringing her lived expertise to the table. And I'll tell you, I told Marty I was going to talk about this. Partway through our session, young people were all sitting on couches, and she just sat right on the ground, cross-legged, and she looked up at them and just shared her story. And you could have heard a pin drop, and they were like leaning in, and they were so inspired by Marty. And we spent an entire day with these young people, and you know how it is. I mean, it's hard to keep us engaged for an entire day, right? But they were so engaged, they didn't want to leave at the end. And they loved the idea of this book, and they loved giving feedback. And we went through chapter by chapter and took so many notes. And so we're so excited to be working with them. And then Pookie, who's a nurse on the ground there making the V, she's on our team as well. And next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to do next is, so we shot a documentary film in Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness 1.0, and we're just submitting it to film festivals, so I can't share it all just yet, but I can share a 3-minute trailer. And these are young people from the very first Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness study, who also, they all attended the workshop, which was really great. So if you want to minimize, we have it minimized on down below. There you go, yeah. And you can hit play and then just, yeah, full screen. Awesome, thank you. The volume's not on. I know it's working. If you want to just pause it and then maybe move it back. I know we had it working before, so. Sorry, guys. This is it, and then I'm done. I really want to show this to you, so hopefully it works. It's not playing right now, if that helps. If it takes too long, I'll just stop so that we make time for the next person. But we did test it just before, so it should work.
When I was growing up, I felt very, very alone. So I always carried a sketchbook with me. It just kind of, it helped fill that void, you know?
The Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness project, what we're looking at is social and economic inclusion. Once they leave the shelter system, there was kind of this big gap in our knowledge about what happens to these young people.
At this point, I have nothing left to hide.
We talk a lot about, let's help folks get out of homelessness. And typically we talk about, let's get them a house. A house is not necessarily a home. A home is a different thing.
When I was in shelter, I was not seeing myself as that kind of homeless, like stay in the shelter. I'm like, I have to get out from here. Like I have to do things,
If you imagine society like a big circle and these young people are on the outside of the circle, what sorts of things do they need to move inside the circle and feel like they belong?
I was just coping. I was like, one day, that was always my hope. Like I always said to myself, I'm like, one day all this things is going to be over.
We have to realize that when you've had a history of trauma, that really messes up your sense of self. And so it's a rather simplistic and maybe a privileged notion to think we can just give a young person with all this history of trauma and all these messages in their lives that told them that they didn't belong. Just give them a house and that's going to fix all that. It's not going to.
I was going down a bad path. I know what it feels like to be homeless, and I know how it feels like to have nobody. I know what pain feels like, you know?
We need to do a better job, and indeed we can do a better job of helping young people exit homelessness.
When people hear about homelessness, they literally think, oh, everyone that's homeless is a drug addict or something. Did the best I could, you know?
I constantly think about the things that I've been through as inspiration. I think it's dealing with those things that people do to you and the things that you feel and challenging them, like I'm doing, is one of the best ways to deal with that. Take something ugly and turn it beautiful, right? Or accept it for what it is and find beauty in that.
Thank you. And thank you guys.
Sorry, just kidding. Oh, sorry, I think that's the wrong one. No worries.
Okay, we can do this one too. Won't be as engaging, I'm sure.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. My name is Samantha Sage-Lob, and this is my colleague Bonnie Harkness. And we are here today representing the Youth Homelessness Prevention and Housing Stabilization Strategy of the York Region. We're going to be discussing our By Youth for Youth Youth Breaking Barriers project. This project was jointly funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. And before we go into it, I just want to share one of our key takeaways from the presentation, which is that currently there's not enough youth voice within strategies, projects, and solutions that are revolving around youth-related issues. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Bonnie, and she's going to discuss a little bit more about the youth strategy as well as our project goals.
Can we go to the next slide? It's the first time in my life I've not been the shortest in the room. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm certainly not the star of the show, that's Sam, but I definitely want to share some of our experiences. So 360 Kids, a number of years ago, just for those of you that don't know who we are, we're an organization that works in homelessness and with youth at risk of homelessness and youth who are experiencing homelessness in York Region. And we had been doing this work for 30 years in our community, and we worked extremely well with a ton of partners trying to end and prevent homelessness. And as many of you in this room, you can imagine that it's pretty frustrating 30 years later, we're still have a ton of homeless kids and even more. So we started to think a bit differently and say, we're not actually going to solve homelessness ourselves or at the table with just other housing providers. We need other people at the table. We need all of the, stakeholders that impact, that come into connection with young people. So in that, and I apologize, I'm just getting over something, so if I start to cough, that's why I keep clearing my throat. So we ended up going out and working with, we first approached, our region, we approached United Way, and both were really excited about the idea of creating this collective impact approach that was going to bring stakeholders together and try and prevent and end homelessness in our community. At that time, we became, what we offered was the backbone support. So we still are just our one voice at the table, and this is absolutely a community strategy. What was fortunate for us was because of all that long-standing relationship in our community, it was quite easy for us to bring people around the table. So not only do we have the school boards at the table, the child welfare agencies, the police, EMS, service providers such as mental health providers, housing providers. We have businesses, we have foundations. The Home Depot Foundation sits at our table. So we're bringing in everybody and anybody who has anything to do with young people, including young people. So the other piece is that what we recognized is we sit around the table. I often refer to it as a bunch of adults sit around a boardroom table and we decide what's best for youth. And we're so far away from, as much as I think I'm still young, so far away from where they're at. And I haven't always walked a mile in their shoes. So if we listen to young people, they'll tell us exactly what works and what doesn't work. So in our strategy, we were fortunate, but what happens is we have a steering committee. So this is just our governance structure, just to give you an example. We have a steering committee that's made up of service providers, all those people I mentioned. We also had a lot of support from Away Home Canada, Making the Shift, the Laidlaw Foundation. So we were looking at other communities across Canada. Who's done this before? Who can we learn from and who can we share with? So that was actually where we started. And we developed a youth council. And the first youth council we had was about 10 participants. And then we started to create the strategy. We started to go to all the research. We started to talk about all the issues we heard from our young people. And out of that came 5 sort of focus areas. So we have prevention, for those of you at the back that might not be able to see, prevention and early intervention, leadership and collaboration, structural barriers, transform systems, and housing stabilization. And then this next circle talks about, now that's the working group. So it's not just this 30 people and 10 youth members that are going to do this work. We need to get broader and get everybody involved from our community. So then we started to think about, well, how do we make sure that in all of these areas that we're including evaluation, that we're learning from this and we can share from this? How are we including the EDI piece, like that we know is absolutely a big part of it? The government relations, if we're going to change policy, we need to have government there. So we started to do this work, and we're now at the stage of implementation. So getting us here felt pretty easy, comparatively speaking, to a lot of communities that really struggled to get the people to the table. We didn't have that problem. Now, what our problem is that we're so good at this, and we have such an amazing strategy. There's lots of initiatives that have come out of this. There's lots of youth voices, and now we're trying to figure out how to do it and how to evaluate it on a much bigger scale. So that's where we are today. If we can just go to the next slide. So one of the things that came out, one of those initiatives that came out of it was young people were telling us that one of the areas is that they experienced, with lived experience, that they didn't know was about the landlord tenancy. They didn't know their rights or their responsibilities, and oftentimes that would land them in places that were unsafe, uninhabitable at times, and that they really wanted to see more advocacy, more awareness for young people. And they also recognized that the way, if any of you have young people at home, you'll know that they learn everything and know everything from social media. So they thought that was a great idea, that if we were to do some sort of TikTok videos, or, and I say they were to do TikTok videos or YouTube videos, that way it would have a wider spread to young people, not just, all the other places we do it naturally in schools and all the rest continue, but let's get it out to where kids are really getting their information. And so that's where essentially the For Youth by Youth project was born. And through the support of CAMH and a research grant, we were able to support them financially to be able to put together these videos for young people. So essentially, and I think am I loud enough still? Okay. So essentially, what happened was that now we've basically created an avenue for young people to come together. And so not only did they have an opportunity to create these videos for other youth, but they also were able to take our first initiative off of our strategy and get going on it. So I say that because I think it's pretty important that here we are trying to figure out how do we do this, all these great ideas, and the ones right out of the gate were the youth, and the ones that got our first initiative sort of to completion were the young people. So hence, get out of their way. So I'm going to pass it back over to Sam now.
If we could just switch it to the next slide, please. Thank you. So for this project, it was completely spearheaded by the Youth Council, and the Youth Council is composed, myself included, of young people who have firsthand experience with homelessness or risk factors. And so what we did to start is we began by having a discussion about our experiences. And we found that a lot of people on council had very similar experiences. A lot of us didn't know about our tenancy rights, and it got us into precarious situations. We had issues relating to rent increases, for example, where a landlord says, hey, I'm going to increase your rent by 10%. And, we had to leave our housing. We didn't know that it can only be increased by a certain amount every year. We had issues relating to locks and privacy, where locks on the doors weren't working and were not being replaced in a timely manner, so it created a safety issue. And as well as shared amenities, we didn't realize that it doesn't necessarily make it so that you're covered under the landlord-tenant board if you're in a specific situation with shared amenities. So using these situations, what we did is we created topics, which were, what does it mean to be at risk of homelessness, the landlord-tenant board, the Residential Tenancies Act, locks and privacies, and shared amenities. And so using these topics, we split into subgroups. We did our research. One of our council members even read the entirety of the Residential Tenancies Act from front to back, just to make sure everything was accurate. And we created scripts for videos. We filmed the videos, but before we did that, we went through a 4-part equity, diversity, and inclusion process. And so that, we brought it to the steering committee, for example, and we had a lot of stakeholders take a look and consider who might be left out or who might benefit from some extra supports within the videos. And that equity, diversity, and inclusion process led us to, for example, captioning the videos with anything said is written, so that it helps with individuals who have hearing impairments, for example, or people who have auditory processing disorders, or just learn better reading. So with that idea in mind, what we did with these videos is we pulled some of the key information and we created other avenues to digest the information. How I learn is not the same as my peers on youth council. We all have different learning styles. So it was more about quality than quantity. There's a lot of information in there, but how can we make sure that we're repeating it in different ways so that everybody has access to learning? It's not about, teaching in one way. It's about making sure that we're giving access to the knowledge in different ways. So what we did with that information is we teamed up with Blue Door, for example, and we created training modules for the employment program using the videos and slides that go with it. We also made an infographic, which we have copies of here if anyone would like, and we can hand them out afterwards. And those pieces are just taking the same information. Now, when we were doing the rollout, we have our social media campaign. So all of the videos are online on YouTube. If you go to the Instagram handle @YouthStrategy, within the bio, you'll be able to have access to the link, and we'll be putting the handle up later on. So aside from that, we were reaching out to a lot of organizations, and we decided, okay, how can we keep track to make sure that we know who we're working with? And while we were doing that, we realized we're sitting on a gold mine here. We have all these resources, all these organizations that a lot of us didn't know about. Currently, we're in the works of creating a digital resource page. And the goal for that page is that if you're experiencing mental health struggles, if you're experiencing issues with tenancy, if you need a shelter, for example, you can go on that page, find different resources in your area. Maybe you tried something before and it didn't work. Well, there will be other resources there. So that's where we're going with the project moving forwards. Through these different tools that we've created, I feel that we've shown that youth are intelligent, we're motivated, and we are aware of what we need to help us. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it back to Bonnie.
And we'll go to the next slide. And Sam made a really good point about being capable. You're darn right they're capable, and that's why I go back to get out of their way. Get out of their way, get out of their way. So for us, we recognize too that, we've talked a lot about bringing young people with lived experience in to the conversations, to the table. And what does that really mean? I really feel like I've straddled in both worlds. I still feel connected even in my 50s to my youth, but I recognize that a lot of young people just bring at the table with a bunch of adults, mostly executives, because those are the people that need to make decisions in their agency, is not really being inclusive. We're not really giving them a voice. We're just sitting them at the table. So what we wanted to make sure of in our strategy was that there was an opportunity for young people to come together on their own, so that they could speak in their language at their pace. They can, share everything. They could build the confidence. They could build trust in us. So we had a facilitator that was at both. And then when the pandemic hit, fortunately for us, I will say, not most fortunate for most, but in this case, we had to go to the video platforms, which meant that now we could include youth at the table in a different way that we hadn't done before. So not being physically there gave them a bit more confidence, a bit more opportunity to have relations with the bigger strategy. So now we not only have young people still meeting on their own because they wanted that, they really appreciated that space to, I call say it as it is, like I personally encourage them to say it as it is at the steering committee, but they're not always comfortable. And then they also continue to sit at our steering committee level and participate at that level. They participate in all of our subgroups and our working groups. And they also have, as I mentioned, the council and projects that they take on themselves. So it's not just having them at the table, it's about giving them meaningful opportunities. So this example of the For Youth by Youth project was a meaningful opportunity for them to not only, and Sam didn't mention this, and I'm going to, because not only did the youth strategy put this together, but everybody that was involved in that video production was a young person. So they had, like, what did you have? You had the makeup artist, you had the cinematography,
even the music. So it was all done by people who identify as youth, and the majority of the people involved were also people who have lived experiences with homelessness and risk factors.
So for me, that's a great opportunity for them not only to showcase their skills, but also make connections with other service providers, which Sam was saying, some of them wanting to be in social work. Now they're actually in front of and working closely with members of the community. So they're being heard, they're participating, they play a role. It's not just tokenism. And I know, none of us intend to do it in the way of being token, but it turns out to feel that way a lot of times for young people. And so for our strategy, we're constantly looking for leadership opportunities for young people. That's one of our goals, is how do we not only have youth at the table making decisions. No decision in our strategy happens without the okay of the youth and the steering committee. It's almost like that, infinity sign where it goes together. And so for me, that's probably the most important, is making sure that everything that we, first of all, it's authentic, that we're honest, we're transparent, we're talking to them. Like I said, they brought forward the initiative, and they were the first ones out the gate. So when they have skin in the game, it's likely to happen. And I think we've all heard this, and I'll say it again, is that there should be nothing for youth without youth. And so that's really, I'm going to pass it backwards to this tag team thing. You can go to the next slide.
So to discuss our achievements, there's two different types of achievements for this project. And the first is our personal achievements as a youth council. Like Bonnie mentioned, a lot of us are going into specific fields or have certain skills and knowledge, and it gave us a chance, it gave us a chance to showcase that specific knowledge and our skills. So like I mentioned before, one of the youth council members, he does music, and so he made the music for the videos. We have another member who did the makeup. I myself am going into the field of child development and education, and so I had a big stake in the script making to make sure that it all made sense and was at a certain speaking level. And so we all had opportunities to showcase our skills and knowledge, but a lot of us are also interested in certain areas, and it gave us the chance to try our hand at certain things, learn new skills, make new connections, and that's where we created the bridge between youth and community. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of people who are in the field that I'm going into and learn from them and make those connections, and a lot of us on council feel the same way about that. So we had our leadership opportunities, and we built awareness for ourselves as well. While we were doing our research and we were going over these scripts, a lot of us were going, oh, I was in that situation. I didn't know that. So going forward, we have the awareness for tenancy rights. We had our leadership opportunities, and we're taking those with us to create more leadership opportunities. We've created a bridge between our youth council and the community stakeholders and people who are in decision-making positions. And we've had the ability to show our capabilities. So that's the personal level of the achievements. And on a larger scale, we were able to bring awareness to tenancy rights, because the thing with tenancy is that you don't learn about this in school. It's not part of the Ontario curriculum. It's something that if a teacher chooses to teach you about it, they're doing so in a way that they choose to do it. So a lot of people learn about it from their parents. But if you don't have a home situation where you're going to learn those skills, you're kind of at a disadvantage. And that was the case for a lot of us on council. So through the videos, through the infographics, the training modules, we're able to bring awareness to the younger generation about their tenancy rights and about where they can go to assert those rights. Because it's one thing to know, it's another thing to be able to take your rights and make sure that you're in a position where people are respecting your rights. So that was the larger impact. And then on top of that, going forward, we now understand a little bit more about what needs to be done and where we need to go, so that for our future projects, we can include all of those factors. So it was really a multi-part achievement process. And aside from the personal level, we do feel like we are educating younger people, and we are able to bring that awareness that we didn't necessarily have. And that was really the goal of the project, was to inform youth of tenancy rights, because we felt that we didn't have that information. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So for our takeaways, like I mentioned in the beginning, there is not enough youth voice within strategies, projects, solutions that are all revolving around youth issues. And youth involvement is the key to a project's success, because I know for myself, I have a younger sibling who's 4 years younger than me, and his world is so much different than mine. I'm only 26, but the generation gaps are getting smaller, especially with technology. So we have to consider that if I'm 26 and I'm feeling out of touch with him who's 4 years younger, think about the kids who are growing up in elementary school right now. I'm in the elementary schools at the moment, and their world is so much different than what my world was. So bringing in younger people, bringing in people who are in their teens, for example, and are aware of the issues that are affecting them, because like I said, we're intelligent, we're aware, that makes a big difference in terms of projects and moving them forwards and making sure that a project is successful. Because if a project's successful, it means that you're helping the youth. And without the youth's voice, how do you know what's going to help them? If I can move to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I always joke with her. I was joking with Sam earlier when she was saying that, you know, young people need to be at the table, because essentially she's telling us we're old and we don't know what we're doing, which is perfect because we don't. No. So here's our contact information. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming here today. If you're interested in learning more about our youth strategy, about the By Youth for Youth project, you can contact us. We'd be happy to share everything and anything we know and learn from you in your communities if you're doing anything similar or that you feel would contribute. So thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Hi, welcome. We just had report that the audio is down in the whole building, quite possibly. So if I can get a thumbs up from someone in the back that you can hear me, thank you. This is gonna be great. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole. This is my colleague Jen, and we are coming to you from Mokinstis, from Calgary on Treaty 7 territory, where we work for an organization called Trellis, which is the recently merged Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary and Aspen Community and Family Services. And wanted to share with you a case study that we think has some valuable takeaways for folks in the audience. There should be a slide before this. There it is. To start with some background, Trellis operates a shelter for youth called Avenue 15. It's that red building there. And over the past number of years, we've invested as an agency in evolving that program towards focusing on diversion, focusing on family and natural supports, lots of the themes that we've talked about at this agency. I do evaluation work where Jen has managed Avenue 15 and now manages the Boreal. And we see in the data a persistent challenge of two cohorts of youth. AV serves 150 to 200 youth a year. And there's a large cohort of youth for whom the emergency shelter intervention does what it's supposed to do. Stays are short or relatively short. Youth stay once in the year, not necessarily repeat or systematic visits. And at the bottom there, we track trajectories in and out of shelter. So we're seeing that in a lot of cases, youth are coming from natural support setting and leaving to natural support setting, in which case the emergency shelter really just focuses on bridging that gap and is often quite a successful intervention. Go to the next slide. However, we did identify with the staff team and in the data as well, this challenge of a smaller cohort of youth for whom the intervention wasn't working. This is, I imagine, a familiar experience for lots of folks in the room. There were frontline staff who really had this deep sense of knowing of this smaller group of youth who were cycling in and out of shelter, who were exhibiting very high-risk behaviors, multiple comorbidities, and being juggled between what was ultimately inadequate placements in places like group care, maybe in scattered site living, and other types of settings. So we had this sense from the staff that, if you had to, I could name you those dozen youth, by name. I, on the other hand, am sitting behind spreadsheets and seeing the same names year over year, and we're thinking, we know we're serving these youth. But part of being an emerged agency is knowing that, I actually saw that youth pop up a few years ago in another setting, or we can see the patterns of something we're doing isn't working. We ended up working to shift our key performance indicator data to track youth with children's services involvement separately, thinking that might reveal something, as well as some deep dives into shelter records. And we landed on a by name list of 23 youth. These youth represented 15% of all youth served, but about 50% of bed night stays. For folks who have experience in the adult shelter system, all the analysis on these massive data sets, right, about transitional and episodic and chronic homelessness. Given the relative size of Avenue 15, like I said, it's this deep sense that we know who these youth are. But we need to rally the data in order to prove to the powers that be that we ought to do something differently. When we pulled the data and worked with the team, we found some various obvious outcomes that, again, were expected for this cohort, but putting them on paper and in a list of by name youth became quite an effective tool. All these 23 youth had past children's services involvement. Often the files were quite complex, multiple CS statuses, maybe a resistance to opening a children's services file, quite complex situations. All but 3 were either currently using or had histories using meth or fentanyl. All but 1 youth had spent more than a month in the youth justice system. There were incredibly replicable systems involvement for these youth. CYOC was the one that really jumped out at us. But cycling in and out, compared to that other cohort of youth who came to and from natural supports, this cohort of youth tended to cycle in between system placements. And because we're in a large agency, we had the ability to analyze other program involvement due to Trellis's size. We found 4 of these youth had actually popped up in our after-school care programming about a decade previous. And so given the number of group care settings we run, a number of Housing First for Youth programs we run, we could really see multi-systems involvement just from the sightline of a single agency. Go to the next slide. So we had the list, we had the stories, and we put it all together. We ended up collaborating on developing profiles for each of these youth that involved their current status, their major presenting needs, the youth strengths, which was a really important part of the story. On paper, these youth often looked like they were failing out of placements, and yet this knowing of the youth and knowing who they were and their strengths meant that there was another story there to be told. We pulled their existing supports. We pulled the Children's Services Office and caseworker looking to identify any patterns there, and the shelter use patterns. The province of Alberta has the role of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. That office completes a mandatory review annually of deaths of children and youth in care. For the better part of a decade, the youth in that profile typically have touched Avenue 15 at one time or another. And in the period between when we collated this list of 23 youth and when we launched the program some 8 months later, 2 youth passed, and OCYA interviewed us. We helped shape, their understanding of these youth strengths and how the system really failed them. The program that eventually came out of this work and this presentation to you all is dedicated in their memory. We'll go to the next slide. We then worked to develop the vision for the Boreal, which is the program that we later launched. The important thing here is that we're trying to thread the needle between where we knew group home placements, weren't necessarily succeeding. There was some scattered site placements, again, not necessarily working. We sort of had some foyer references. And so this eventually was sort of trying to find the sweet spot for, again, that small cohort of youth. So we landed on a small apartment style building with 8 to 12 units, controlled access, 24/7 staffing, lots of the sort of typical things you would expect to see for this group of youth. A specific emphasis though on low barrier eligibility requirements, no preconditions for housing. This is, I think we'd argue, the most low barrier intervention in the city. Focus on engagement, delivering lots of on-site experiential, cultural, and life skills programming, clinical supports, huge emphasis on family and natural supports, and a really meaningful engagement with harm reduction, which Jen will speak to in a moment. We put this data in front of a lot of people. A lot of our Government of Alberta stakeholders, we brought forward to them some cost impact analysis. Again, being able to see these youth in multiple systems meant we can put a price tag. Again, as my colleague had said, the interventions that were existing versus the intervention we were suggesting had an obvious cost benefit. We brought the data to Children's Services, and a particular, I think, victory was leaving that meeting and them sharing back to us that they couldn't unsee what we had shared with them. Children's Services, of course, has all of the data that we put in front of them, but shaping it in this specific way, telling these specific stories was really impactful. We ended up collaborating with the Ministry of Community and Social Services and identifying a possible program space, and then landing on an operational contract. Next slide, thank you. With that ministry, establishing a master lease agreement, and opening the building. This came together really in remarkably short order. And part of that was really telling the story of this is a list of 23 youth. And in those profiles, I can tell you that the months until they turn 18. And I can tell you that we've lost 2 youth on that list already. So if there ever was a moment to try and move quickly and towards an innovative pilot, now would be that time. And I think collaborating with the staff team, feeling like we've known for years that we need to do something different, but now we have traction, we have data, we have this pitch. How do we move forward? Oh my goodness, sorry.
Next slide. And so we opened. So running the Boreal was, I guess, a little bit scary because it was brand new and we had to, hire a brand new staff team. We were in a brand new building. So we got this really unique sort of opportunity to have all of our 15 staff sort of get trained together, which was really cool because we got to build this amazing team. And we came up with some goals that, the kids could stay as long as they needed to. And we would sort of, start working on their transition plans as soon as they came into the building. But I guess, sort of let them guide that sort of pathway into where they wanted to be next. The placement, sort of finding the kids, we leaned into the coordinated access, and that kind of led us to this huge group of kids. So we sort of pared it down and figured out who needed, the Boreal the most. 7 of 8 of the kids that moved in had already, had involvement with Trellis, mostly within the shelter system. Our first youth moved in May 2022, and we were full by September. So that was with 8 kids. It was very busy, very, very fast. Next slide. So what's working? The first thing I would say is, I guess, true harm reduction. We had sort of tried some different things in different programs, but the Boreal has a really, really serious focus on harm reduction. So whether that is giving kids safe use supplies, helping them build really, really, I guess, harm reductive relationships that we can sort of be uncomfortable with, but make sure that we're really investing for them. We have amnesty at the Boreal, which means that the kids can store whatever they need to store on site, which has really, really helped because they, they're very respectful and very open about, substances, weapons, things like that. And they will, hand them in when they come into the program. What we found is that the kids moving into sort of this culture of really harm reduction, they are very, very open. There's no judgment, and these are kids who have overdosed tons and tons of times in the past, and they're texting staff and letting them know that they're using. They're phoning, they're coming downstairs and asking to be watched, which is huge. So no AWOL rules. The kids can come and go as they please. They're mostly there, so that's kind of great. No discharge policy, so that means that you really, really can't be asked to leave the Boreal. These kids have been asked to leave so many places, and they are carrying that with them to the next place and the next place. So we, went from our belief that housing is a basic right, and we don't ask them to leave. We just sort of figure it out as it comes. When our first youth moved in, she had this argument on her phone, and we could hear like smashing and crashing in her bedroom. And we went upstairs, and she had packed all her things, and she was ready and, to be asked to leave. And it took her 4 days before she unpacked again and believed us, that we weren't kicking her out. This was her home, and she got to stay, right? So relationships first. So our team has focused so much on making sure that we say relationships first a lot in this world, but like really, really focusing on relationships first, even if it's very uncomfortable for us. We had a young lady who was 8 months pregnant, which can be really scary, right? There's a lot of risk around pregnancy. And so when she moved in with us, there was this sort of reaction where we wanted to protect her, and we wanted to like keep her safe and make a lot of decisions. And we had to just keep cycling to like, will this relationship be damaged by this decision we're going to make? Why are we making these decisions? Is it for us and our comfort, or is it really for her? She actually ended up having the baby, healthy, beautiful baby. She's 90 days sober before she had the baby, and still has the baby and is living with her family now. So, yeah. Prioritizing natural supports. We were so shocked at how many of our kids' families are in the building all the time. Like, they come, they sleep over, they visit. We had a young person who had some really significant mental health challenges, and his dad came and camped with him in the yard. And then the next weekend, his dad took him camping for a night, and then they ended up taking him this summer for 2 weeks. And that's the first time that he's gone anywhere with his family in 7 years, right? Like it was huge for him. So just having that sort of ability in this big building to have their families in the building and spend time with them where the families get to feel safe and the kids feel safe and they can kind of build that way. Youth-centered guest management. So the kids are allowed to have friends over. I feel like we've had so many programs where they can't do that. They can have their people over. So many of our youth have most of their natural supports and their friends are homeless, right? So it's really hard to not be able to have them over. They want to take care of them. So on Mondays, the kids build goals, whatever goals they want to build with their case managers. And if they do those goals by Wednesdays, they get all the visitors they want, well, one. They get like one at a time, otherwise it'd be crazy, but they get, to have their people in the building. We don't manage, who those people are, how they move around the building, right? Like, yes, they can have the doors closed. Yes, they can make their decisions. And yes, we're going to help them, have healthy boundaries and talk about those relationships and learn to have friends over, because a lot of our kids move into market housing and get evicted within 2 weeks because they don't know how to have friends over. They don't know how to set boundaries with their friends. So Nicole talked a bit about our programming. And then space, we were really, really shocked because these are kids I've known for years. And all of a sudden they moved into the Boreal and all this mental health just started coming out that we had never seen. And we realized it's a huge building and they had space. So at the shelter, there's 25 other kids and they're sharing rooms and they don't really have the space to, I guess, have these huge mental health crisis. And so that kind of shocked us, but was really great because they could really start getting those supports and sort of navigating that really significant trauma. And we're working through it. And then external supports, we have a ton of folks that come to the Boreal. We have the clinical team, so we have some therapists that are there twice a week, once a week. The Circle Keeper comes, SafeWorks comes. There's a ton of different folks and we'll just find whoever. We're blessed with this gorgeous building, so we try to fill it with as much as the kids can do in the building. We all know it's really hard for youth to make it to appointments, so we try to bring as many people into the program as we can. Next slide.
I think as we have gotten funding for this program, one of the major challenges has been, of course, that it's a pilot. There's, I think, 18 months of funding, and yet the entire story behind this program is around youth bouncing through multiple unsuccessful placements. And so there's this deep commitment agency-wide to evaluate this program so intensively. So as we wrap up, just wanted to share some initial findings. Majority of the youth have sexual exploitation concerns. There's low cognition involved. Family and bio parents actively experiencing homelessness, like Jen had mentioned. And a big portion of the Boreal's goal was to get youth in one place for long enough to build relationships so we can strategize about what their next trajectory, their next placement might be. These histories of bouncing between placements and almost not being still enough for long enough to do that relational investment and work means that's a deep focus of this work. We're using a few tools to do that, which should be unsurprising to all of you folks, including a youth strength scale, lots of youth interviews, circle process, debriefs. We're looking at reportable incidents, but we've seen some phenomenal outcomes so far. And last, just wanted to share with you if some thoughts about translating this case study into your work. Asking and inviting you to consider, based on the gaps in services in your work, where are there opportunities for innovation? What do staff share with you in terms of what they notice? And if you ask them a blue sky question, like, if I gave you $1 million, what would you deal with it? And analyzing, what does the data tell you? How could you analyze it differently And then how does that work from staff guide analysis and the inverse, right? How does your data work guide what staff are chatting about? The last slide has our contact information. Thank you very much.
So this part wasn't planned, but what I captured across all the presentations, if you want to come up, or you can stand with me here if you want, or what you want to do, but I captured a number of key themes across these presentations, like reflection, and innovation, and safety, and relationships. But I also captured a level of scaling opportunity that I can see within all of this work, and I'm hoping you see as well. I'd also like to thank the panelists for mentioning the words policy and government at the quota we agreed upon, so your payment will be available after you leave the room. Turn it over to you for questions. At the back.
Yeah, this would be a question for Jen and Nicole. In terms of, because you brought up this really amazing thing where you can finally have friends over and bring people over. I often encounter youth who either don't tell their worker, but they're keeping someone in their apartment, or they're not telling the landlord. I just want to know, like, do you folks see that? Like, what do you do in those instances?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like, everywhere else that involves losing their housing, right? But over there, it doesn't sound like that would happen. So, like, what do you folks do about it?
So there is controlled access to the building, so staff have to let the youth in and out of the building. So, which is why we kind of get them to write like a list of visitors. They can switch the list once a week. They get 5 visitors on the list. So we don't need their names. The visitors can be any age as long as they just talk to us, put all their things in the amnesty room. But that's exactly why we did it. The visitor was kind of a topic of discussion when we first opened because the staff were like, oh, these complex kids and then all their friends, right? So it's a lot more work, but one of the biggest things that gets youth evicted is that, right? Like sneaking other folks in or not ever asking them to leave. So that's a lot of the goals that we work on is around relationships and boundaries and things like that. But they've been pretty good because I think giving them, letting kids do what they really need to do and want to do is easier than, saying no and being fear-based.
And I do think one of the big reasons that succeeded is reflective of staffing and the building's design. So kids have the opportunity to practice guest management, I guess, in like a supported way. And there's this sense that like you get to pick who's on your list. Like we don't have like a veto power over those folks. And there's a sense that we'll support you to practice those guest management techniques that ideally will follow you wherever you head next. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very beautiful. Kudos to the work that you do.
Thanks. Just a follow-up question. Can you tell me about the staffing? Where did you recruit your staff and team from?
And are they coachable?
No. We actually have a huge range of staff from brand new first job ever in the field to a lot of experience. We're double staffed all the time. And then we also have 2 case managers. So 1 case manager for 4 kids, and they're not tied to the to the floor, so they can come and go because there's a lot of appointments and all of that kind of stuff that they do. And then we have a site supervisor, and she sort of works whenever I'm not there, right? So we kind of like go back and forth. But yeah, we hired just a huge range. But I really think the 10 days of training, building the program, we made them build IKEA furniture.
Phenomenal.
Seriously? It builds a team or breaks it, right? So, yeah.
And I think too, another piece there is that the relatively low youth to staff ratio, right? And the emphasis on harm reduction as like an endorsed practice rather than like a thing you'd have to do like, oh, it's like everyone feels a bit sketchy about it. It's like, no, this is like the way we practiced here. It's held in common and people are values aligned to that. I think creates a really strong staff culture as well.
Back here, and then David, and then front. Yeah.
So
Yeah, we for sure have. So as far as physical violence goes, we are really upfront with the youth, right? Like we'll say, we don't love involving, CPS, but we do have a relationship with our community resource officers. So if something happens in the building that would happen outside and police would be called, that would be what would happen inside the building, right? And then it's just a matter of sort of navigating that with the kids. One of our biggest focus is building community. So they have like a living room they all hang out in. They're all very intertwined and very close, like a little family. But I think there's like this knowledge that this is it. If they're there, there isn't probably somewhere else they could be. And they know they have to live together. So there's a lot of mediation. So a lot of conversations, but physical violence would mean figuring it out. Drug dealing, I mean, we'll just go harm reduction on that, right? We'll educate, we'll make friends with those folks if they're from outside and figure out what they need to be supported and have some really frank conversations. But that is like, some of our kids are 22 and some of them are, selling drugs. Some of them are doing sex work, and it's about trying to educate them and keep them safe and help them make decisions that they want to make.
And just talking through it, was able to maintain safety within the building for all the youth in there.
Yeah.
Which feels unreasonable. I get I hear it. And
Full disclosure, I run a building like this.
Yeah.
I have up to 25 male youth.
there it is.
That's the difference.
I was gonna ask, what's your gender ratio, like your gender identity for the young people that that are living in this building? Not what you would accept, just actually who's living there right now,
It's
mostly
mixy.
female, mostly non-binary folks,
5 and 3.
It's I would say there's 1 or 2 non-binary and then half and half-ish. Yeah.
Was that your question?
Yeah.
There's 2 hands back there.
Yeah.
Sort of first question is for Jen and Nicole. Just wondered to what extent does developmental disabilities pop up in Ontario? I think it's one of the largest gaps there are because pre-18 versus over 18 and everything's here to 18
Preach.
plus. So
Yep.
when you're homeless, you're what do we do? Adult, right? So I just wondered how do you navigate that? And then I want to talk to you separately about how you get rural, that sort of scale of funding for rural, because rural Ontario and Toronto gets it all.
Yeah.
So just wondering, would love to chat with you on the side.
Yeah, let's totally chat. On the disability front, that's a soapbox of mine. And I think that I had it up there, I believe 5 of 8 currently have some kind of disability. And what we see is that our existing placements as far as scattered site housing for youth and even group care, those are deeply ableist interventions, I might suggest. And so again, having youth in one place for long enough to really think strategically about who's the team, what's the funding, who's missing from the table. Bless these funders who invested in us for 18 months, but many of our conversations have been about there are missing ministries in this contract, and it's an incredible indictment on their work. And so the advocacy gently continues, right, to be who's missing from the table, who can we fold in, but it's a long game. They're not there yet.
So thank you very much for acknowledging the unheard voices of people with disabilities. And so my question is for Samantha, Bonnie, and we're talking about meaningful involvement of youth. I was thinking of it in terms of other communities who are marginalized as well, and when it comes to involvement, one of the things I find is missing a lot is compensation, fair compensation for the youth experiences, for emotional labor. So I'm just wondering about whether you have processes around that and if people were
absolutely do, and that's a great, and I'm sorry I didn't actually cover that, because that was one of the things that we recognized, that every time we ask people with lived experience to come to the table, we ask them to do it for free or for gift cards or things like that. And we decided early on that we were going to add it into the budget, just like we were staff salaries, and that we were going to pay people for their time and their expertise. So they recognizing that we're all there at the table and getting paid, they should too. So all of our youth council, every young person that participates gets paid for all of their time. So just like a relief or a part-time person, they put in invoices to us and we reimburse them.
Thank you. So many times, like the organizations, they get millions of dollars in funding, and none of the funding goes to the youth.
No, and I will, just for the Kevin, I will say, we would love to make it more, because the truth of the matter, like our staff, and many of you will agree, we don't pay people doing this incredible work nearly enough. Half the time we're helping people who are on the margins, and our staff are on the margins due to government funding and things like that. So majority of our costs are often in staffing to make the work, because it's the people. And I think some of these questions, we run similar programs, and some of the things I'll just add, that it's the relationship with the kids that keeps it safe. It's not all those other things. So the fact that you have a smaller group of kids and that you're working with them, the fact that you value their contribution, both in a financial way and in a, in a collaborative way, like we would with our colleagues, appreciating their contribution, I think is really important.
This question back here, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This question is for Shelley. I was just wondering, from a data perspective, are you considering collecting data from young people on the accessibility of the program to find out how accessible they find the components of the program?
Yeah. Yes. And part of the conversation has been about how we over survey or inappropriately gather data, right, on this cohort of youth. Arguably, those 23 youth, we have data coming out our eyeballs on those youth. And so the conversation has been, what would meaningful data collection look like? And how can the youth actually help us inform what that is? And so at this point, we have sort of the like administrative data complement, right, like nights in, program, reportable incidents, all that kind of stuff, but are really actively working to do the qualitative work of understanding their stories pre-program and coming out of program, like a bit of what Jen had shared, to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing, as far as even things like house meetings, circle process, those kinds of pieces, while still holding space for the fact that some of the clinical work and really private one-on-one work that's going to happen in program has to remain confidential, and that part of their trauma, right, is related to some of that, I think, exploitation that comes from youth who are high systems users and then maybe are seen as success, right, and it's yucky, like exploitative times. So really trying to thread that needle of balancing youth voice, staff experience, and ultimately doing the dance, right, of the government dollars outcomes game.
Hi, I have a question for Nicole and Jen. I just wanted to know, like, you had stated, it was a shocking comment that, like, most of the 23 youth that you work with had, what was it again? Had connection with the agencies before, right? So my question is, with that research that you got, what can you do, or what are you doing if you're doing it now, with the programs that are still existing? So not the new program, but the programs that are still existing, the after school program, to maybe stop the cycle?
Yeah, I mean, preach, right? Like that's the whole project. I would say the impetus behind the merger of our two agencies was actually to say, like, one of the conundrums in the nonprofit world is arguably we have too many silos, right? And if we smash everybody together, maybe we can identify, like, oh, this kid in preschool's parent is over here in this housing program, that kind of thing. We are, as an agency, I think in the early days of really trying to leverage our client relationship management database to inform that, like, intrafamilial work, and reflecting some of this analysis in our family homelessness programs. I think when we looked at that list of 23 youth, this sense of holding two things at the same time. On the one hand, that we are complicit in failing those youth, no holds barred. And on the other hand, knowing that the complexity of social services means that there's no intervention that's 100% successful. And so in some ways, the redeeming, I think, piece for us has been Jen and her staff have invested relationally with these youth for a very long time. And for whatever reason, they continue to return to that red building, which is weird in a lot of cases. And so how can we take whatever that is and then expand it, add some dollars to it and try and catch it again, right? And it's deeply, I would say, distressing to me to look at that data and be like, oh wow, they were here when they were 9.
It's all very uncomfortable.
It's
the whole
so uncomfortable.
program. It's just like rooted in
and that evaluation work and bringing it to leadership and saying like, it doesn't look great. And at the same time, we have thousands of kids that aren't cycling back, right? And so we can hold both of those at the same time. Yeah, I don't know. That's.
Thank you. I think we have room for 2 more questions. There was one here, and there was one there. And then you'll have to catch them at the end and grill them.
My question is for Naomi.
Oh, hi.
Just wondering, I thought your presentation was really compelling, and I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more about the funding piece of how those portable subsidies happened, or where you got that pot of money from, and as well the partners that you worked with, the 3 or 4 partners that you worked with, how those people were chosen, and if you are doing any more sort of like research things after this.
Yes. Maybe I'll stand just because I'm like,
Yeah,
there you go. Yeah, so I'm really fortunate. So I work at a research institute, the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions, and they have a strong foundation. So it's St. Mike's Hospital Foundation, and that is where I'm getting my rent subsidy money from, which is great. Many of you know that if you've applied for funding, you can't always use it for things like portable rent subsidies. So, and there's one person in particular that's just been a really generous donor and really believes in this work. So that's where I get that work. In terms of community partners, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'm a nurse practitioner and I've been at Covenant House for 11 years. And so I've just kind of gotten to know people at conferences like this. A lot of it is informal relationships that have just been developed over years. So that's why we first started working with the Raft and Living Rock in Hamilton and now Stepstones. I'm really just informally meeting people. And then what was your final question about?
Next steps for research.
Yeah, so they're small because I'm testing to see, and so I'm really excited about this study that we're doing 2.0, where we're matching young people with a coach and a co-design leadership guide. If this works, we're hoping to scale this up across Canada with a few hundred youth, and see what it looks like there. Nice. Yeah. Thanks.
You're next. We're gonna wrap this up. Yeah.
My question is for Charlie. First of all, thank you so much for the amazing work that you do. Very impressive. And I would like to learn a little bit more. How have you managed to get the staff running on the no discharge and all this, which is very helpful? And the second is related with parents and career polls. You know, a lot of them face discrimination with the youth shelters. So how again have you been able to support them in stream that intertwined kind of security amongst the residents?
So the first one, I feel like just starting with, telling a staff team that that's just the expectation. It's really hard to go backwards from there, right? Like saying like, you're never going to say to someone that housing isn't a basic need. No one's going to argue with that. So if every time there's an incident, you just bring it back and have that discussion and have reflective practice and always just refer to that, it's really hard to argue with, right? Especially if this is the work you care about. So just being really...
I think another piece of that, to be fully candid, is the funder. didn't put a timeline. Like we brought it to them and we were like, this is what we're gonna do. And they said, yeah, all right. You let us know how it goes. And it's, I mean, we've been operating for not a super long time. I would say as an agency, we have an incredible amount of experience on this front, and we feel pretty confident in that no discharge policy, but it hasn't come down to it yet. So like, ask us in a year. And then on the front.
So we did a lot of work at the shelter at Avenue 15 around making sure that we were, following as much of the inclusive safe space framework for shelters that we could. And so we've moved a lot of that into the Boreal. A lot of the things are similar, and just like the first question, I'd say sort of building all of those pieces of making sure that we're considering all the folks that will come, because there's a huge population of different kinds of youth that will be there, and they are living in one community. So really discussing that with the staff team before, we had a ton of really, really difficult conversations to make sure that we were making as many decisions in all the different lenses that we could, including those ones.
And if you haven't read them yet, you can put it into Google and it'll come up. Province of Alberta, LGBT inclusive shelter guidelines, something like that. There was a pretty significant piece of work done in Alberta around how do you structure bathrooms in a safe way, right? What does the intake form look like as far as asking youth about their gender identity, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of really great content in there that came out a number of years ago that has really informed. Yeah.
Excellent. A series of thank yous before you go. Three sets of thank yous. First, to the panel. Thank you for your time. Second, to the Home Depot Foundation Fund, who's funded the industry. And third, to yourselves, for bringing the whites to the young people you work with and work for.
Well done.